Hello Internet, this is Stephen Romney, once again back in your ear and on your screen here on YouTube. And like yesterday, this is me, fresh from another screening, giving you my fresh thoughts on a film I just saw. Today's episode, I'm looking at Unfriended, directed by Levan Gabriadze. I honestly do not know how to pronounce that name, I apologize if I mispronounce it, but with that introduction out of the way, welcome to Romney's Reviews. This was a film I was curious about for a couple of reasons. Firstly, a found footage film using Skype and screen grabs sounded like an interesting idea. At least it seemed like somebody was trying to do something that was unique and different. Secondly, horror films draw very heavily on the zeitgeist of the period in which it is made. What's a topic that's been in the news a lot recently? Cyberbullying. It was a fascinating curiosity to say the least, but unfortunately that's pretty much where it begins and ends for this film, as the novelty only really works for a first-time viewing and not so much for repeated viewings. Part of that is mainly attributed to the fact that there are a lot of reveals and twists throughout the film that are weaved into the moments of build-up and jump scares. It's kind of like a bad M. Night Shyamalan film in that regard, because once you know the twists, a second viewing just isn't going to be fun. As for the scares, it probably could have reined itself in a little bit, since it was trying to use mostly jump scares. They're startling, sure, but they don't really leave anything for the viewer to remember. There was nothing really eerie in this film beyond the initial premise, and the only thing that was really memorable is the final shot of the film because of how it tears the viewer away from the screen they've been looking at for a majority of the film's 82-minute runtime. Another problem I had was how this film was desperately trying to point out the fact that it was taking inspiration from the Amanda Todd case. I understand, nothing comes from nothing. People get inspiration from a lot of different sources, but copying the same style as the viral flashcard video that Amanda Todd made, it just felt a bit wrong in my opinion. It felt a little bit desperate, almost like it was trying to use pre-established imagery to evoke an emotion instead of creating an image that would have been memorable in and of itself. However, this goes along with what I feel is the underlying issue of the film, which is kind of more or less what makes the experience not as great as it could have been. It is very heavy-handed to the point where it's talking down to its audience. I get the feeling this was specifically made for teenage audiences because, let's face it, teenagers are jerks. I mean, I've been guilty of being a bit of a dick myself, but the way this film goes about itself, it just feels like it's a glorified morality play. Now, I understand that many horror films and thrillers, many classic horror films and thrillers, are morality plays. I mean, that is kind of what the idea of horror is supposed to be. It's supposed to kind of explore darker aspects of the human condition, and a lot of these stories tend to raise questions about actions we take as human beings when it comes to our day-to-day interactions with each other. But the way it's executed here is just not that good. It just felt like the film was constantly saying, "This is bad and you should feel bad." It just felt like it didn't expect its audience to get its point without it having it being hammered into them repeatedly over the course of the really short runtime. To end this review on a positive note, there are some things I actually liked about this film. Firstly, it's very reminiscent to a creepypasta, which is a type of horror story that mainly exists here on the internet. I mean, if you're familiar with things like Ben Drowned or Marble Hornets, I mean, Slender Man, most of you watching probably know who that is and where it came from. The way this film is structured is very reminiscent to a way a lot of these stories are told. It's very similar to the urban legends and ghost stories that have kind of popped up all over the internet, and even as I'm kind of thinking about it, the way I would describe this film to another person is more or less how one would write a really good creepypasta. Another thing I also liked about this film is how it slowly brings out these demons that all these characters have inside them over the course of the story, much like a better written morality play. All of these dark secrets are pulled out during moments of tension and fear, much like how they'd be pulled out if people were actually in this sort of situation where they're very much afraid for their lives. A lot of that strength comes from the acting. I have to give the young actors credit for really putting on some very intense and emotional performances. They felt very genuine, something that tends to be pretty difficult for young actors. Overall, this film is an interesting experiment worth looking at as a curiosity. I wouldn't recommend paying full price to see it or really even seeing it in a theater, But if you're browsing Netflix, then it's worth checking out if it pops up as one of the new releases, because the novelty is there. And in my opinion, if you're watching this on your computer or a laptop, it's a lot more immersive than it would have been if you went to see it in a movie theater, because it allows you to get more engrossed in the POV aspect of it. And that was something that kind of bothered me when watching this in the theaters, because, well, you lose kind of that almost intimate sense of the story when you're watching it in a movie theater and it's supposed to be from the perspective of a computer. So, yeah, the novelty is there, but aside from that, there's not really any rewatch value, and the heavy-handedness of the overall story was a little bit off-putting. Not to mention that it also relies on too many of the cliches and tropes of modern horror films. But given that Jason Blum is one of the producers, that should come as no real surprise. Either rent it from Redbox or stream it on Netflix, because it's not really worth seeing it in a theater. All of that said, Unfriended gets a 3.5 out of 5. So that's it for this episode of Romney's Reviews. Thank you for watching, or I guess in this case, listening. I don't know what I'm reviewing next. It's kind of all up in the air at this point, but hopefully sometime soon I will see you, or at the very least, speak to you again. But for now, good night.